This is Who We Are, A Scottish History by Kathy Galloway, published by Wild Goose. I'm Neil, and I'm an editor with Wild Goose, and I work with Sandra Kramer, who's the publishing manager, Jane Dark Riley, who does marketing for Wild Goose and other creative things like designing the cover of This Is Who We Are. Also work with Iona Community, our admin person, and the Zoom master tonight is Iona Community member Isabel Sarl. Thanks very much, Isabel. And so later you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions to Kathy and folk. And this is being recorded for the YouTube channel, the Iona Community YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be seen on the recording, it's best not to ask a question, but we want you to ask a question. So tonight with Kathy, we have Alison Phipps, who's UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts, Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies at the University of Glasgow, and a member of the Iona Community. And also Callum Orr, one of Kathy's brothers, and he's the genealogist for the book. And besides being good at building family trees, he's very good at building and renovating old farmhouses, which he's doing now in the wilds of Peeblesshire. So this is the cover for the book. And what I'll do is I'll read the blurb on the back, and then I'll hand things over to Kathy and co. One generation is short, but the generations are long. Initially intended simply as an imaginative way to record genealogical research, This Is Who We Are turned into an appealing story-based narrative. The more I wrote, says Kathy, the more I realized that my family was in many regards an archetypal lowland Scottish family. They represented almost all the main occupations of lowland Scots for over 300 years. They were both bystanders and participants in wars, religious conflicts, and huge economic and social developments, and in changing class and gender roles. Most interesting to me was discovering the extent to which their lives were affected by the British Empire, by colonialism and neocolonialism, and inward and outward migration, and by the impact of plantation slavery in the Caribbean. All of this seemed so pertinent to the current debate about Scotland's relationship in and to the United Kingdom and in the aftermath of Brexit. And I thought that others might either see their own families replicated in our story or find it an interesting lens through which to view these debates. This Is Who We Are is a book for those looking back, those looking forward, and for the ones to come, and will inspire readers to investigate and discover their own family's social and political history. So I'll hand things over to Alison and Kathy and Callum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you to everyone who's joined us. And I can see just from the amazing array of faces on the screen that we have people who are in the next street to me, as well as people over in North America, in Israel, Palestine. We have people who are up in the borders and the highlands and right down in the lowlands and in southern England, really right across the world. It's fantastic to have so many people here to celebrate the launch of Kathy's book. Kathy emailed me a couple of weeks ago and said, Alison, would you chair this this launch? And I thought, oh my goodness, I've had many an invitation in my time, but the idea of chairing the Galloway Orr family in conversation is perhaps one of the more testing invitations that I've had, but obviously I'm absolutely delighted. I don't know how many of you have begun reading this book, have received the book yet, but it's a really extraordinary read. It's entitled, as Neil was just saying, This Is Who We Are, A Scottish History. But Kathy herself at the start of it claims it for its eccentricity. And there are many things about it in the best sense of that word that allow it to be a glorious, eccentric Scottish history. and also a work of storytelling. But I've also been reflecting myself, and I'm sure those of you who will be eager to hear Kathy and then Callum and others in the family speak about the book, that it's also a book that is an invitation to story making. And I certainly have found myself telling stories of my own family as I've been reading it, of reaching into the worlds that are both similar and very dissimilar to the ones that Kathy's family grew in and was made by. In a gesture that as veteran readers of Kathy's work might recognize, she has reached once again to the poet Kenneth White for one of the quotations that she uses in the book. And I know that Kathy has done this in many books previously, but she's got a wonderful quotation that she uses towards the start of the book, where she says this, quoting Kenneth White: "A country begins with a ground, a geology. When it loses contact with that, it's no longer a country at all. It's just a supermarket, a Disneyland, or a madhouse." And I think as I was reading the book, I was reflecting on the resonance of that as you start, Kathy, you know, in Ayrshire, on a ground, on a geology, in a very real place, but also with the story of rebellion or even trespass, standing in the grounds of a villa on the Roseneath Peninsula, but that you also tell stories of people who were tradespeople, who had their own embryonic supermarkets, both in the mining villages, but in other parts of Glasgow, who lived in these wonderlands of riches that might be fantasy worlds or Disneylands in grand villas, and who inherited and then lost, and others who quite literally were assigned to what might be called a madhouse, in the past the Crichton, the Royal Infirmary down in Dumfriesshire. So I just think maybe if you can tell us a little about, you know, how the book began and what prompted you, or who prompted you first in your family to go and embark on this journey.
Thank you, Alison. The spark for the book really was my brother Callum, who, after our parents died, really at the beginning of the 21st century, started to explore our family history and our family genealogy. And he spent 10 years uncovering the most fascinating stories. And every time we saw him, he had gone a few years back, a generation or half a generation, and not only was he doing this on paper or online, he actually started visiting many of these places, and members of his family, particularly his long-suffering children and his even longer suffering wife, got used to spending half their holidays trekking around graveyards and visiting remote corners of Scotland. And every time we met together as a family, he had more stories to tell. And then eventually somebody said, one of them said, we should write this up. And that just struck me as a really interesting thing to do. And particularly as the Scottish referendum drew nearer, in 2014, a group of our family from all over the world, actually, from Scotland and England and Europe, mainland Europe, and also from Canada, Colombia, at different parts of the world, we all gathered together in a castle. we rented a castle in Ayrshire just to celebrate. We were celebrating a wedding, and we were celebrating the Commonwealth Games coming to Glasgow. We were just celebrating being together and we went to many of these places together. And that really inspired me to think that I could start and write these stories down. And the other people, well, initially I just thought our family might be interested in them. But the more I wrote, the more I really thought that people would resonate with this, because as Alison said, our family story shares so much with the family stories of Lowland Scots over many generations. So I started to write it in 2016, and then my writing time was a little interrupted. So I left it aside in 2017, and I didn't go back to it till 2020. And by that time, many things had happened, not least the vote on Brexit, which we were all pretty horrified by in the family. And some of the public discourse around Brexit, I just found so distasteful and so alarming. And I listened to people complaining about Polish people in the UK, and many of the same people who were prone to talking about the great role of Britain in the Second World War. And I thought, how ignorant these people are. They know nothing about, they really know nothing about British history, and they know nothing about the Polish airmen who fought so bravely in the Battle of Britain. And this is the thanks they get. So it was really, that made me purchase. So I was inspired by, and I thought, I never want my own family to be this ignorant about their history. So it was a combination of a family project that really became a larger project, and also really looked at many of the things that I didn't learn in history at school, although I studied history up to higher and A level, and then studied some history at university. But then I also thought that most people will not read academic history. So there have to be other ways of making people think about their own social history and the social history of their families, their ancestors.
Thanks, Kathy. I think that initial story that you're telling there about the gathering of the family, the gathering of the clans in the castle, and the incongruence of that as well, where you are telling so much of a story that is largely a story of people living in poverty. And then the ways in which the different ways that the empire and the Industrial Revolution and different forms of migration have influenced that in and out of Lowland Scotland in particular, but also with the occasional episode or the occasional moment where you bring people in from other parts of the world, so that it could feel like this is a book. And yeah, this would always be a challenge to anyone writing a book about their family history, is why would anyone else be bothered about your family's history? Well, and that way that you then find resonances and attachments to everywhere from Africa to Aotearoa New Zealand to Dunedin and Otago, through to Canada, and then the members of your family from Ireland, and all of these moments that, clearly based on Callum's good labour, you've been able to weave into your own stories and narratives. And I wonder if you can kind of come back to that moment of realising this wasn't just a story about your own family for your own family, but was actually a story for kith and kin and for a much wider audience than you were originally envisaging.
I think it was partly because the more I read and followed up the not just the people, but the places that they came from, and I realized my own areas of ignorance Of our 16 great-great-grandparents, whose lives effectively spanned the 19th century, 14 of them were Scots, were Lowland Scots. One came from the island of Islay, and one came from Ireland. And the one from Islay and the one from Ireland married each other, so that there's always been this little kind of Gallic Celtic strain, shot through all the lowland farmers and miners. And I think I was really shocked to read more, to learn much, much more about the famines in Ireland, because I remember at school that we learned about the famine, and we learned about people dying in ditches and the huge migration of people, but nobody ever told us that grain was being exported from Ireland during the famine, and that it would have been actually perfectly possible to feed people. I spent years working for an aid agency where people were routinely dealing with disasters, whether natural disasters or climate-related disasters, or related to wars and conflicts. And so I was familiar with some of the things that are involved in feeding people and getting food to people during these disasters. And actually, I realized that the famine in Ireland was to a considerable extent a willed famine, and that much of it was due to the kind of ideological fervor of capitalism during the 19th century, and also with the ideological viewpoint of people in power, primarily in mainland Britain, but also in Ireland, about the Catholic Irish peasantry, who were treated with contempt and disdain in every possible way. And then I found it was very interesting. I think another really important thing for me was discovering the statistical accounts of Scotland. And I know that there are a few of you, I can see that there are a few of you who are here who will know what I'm talking about. And I've had some interesting exchanges with Adrian Shaw, who is currently doing a PhD on the statistical accounts. But these accounts were devised by a very far-seeing man in the late 18th century. And he asked every parish minister in Scotland, so covered the whole of Scotland, for an account of their parish. And it was not just the numbers of people, it wasn't just a demographic one, but it was about the geography, the economy, the landscape, social roles, housing. I mean, it's just a very broad view of that particular parish. And then about 50 years later, another statistical account was done, and they're called the old statistical accounts and the new statistical accounts, and they are all online. And if you ever have any time where you've got nothing to do and you're feeling a little bit bored, go and look where, look up the statistical accounts, because they give you an unparalleled view of Scotland in the late 18th century, in the 1790s, and in the middle of the 19th century. And one of the things that was absolutely fascinating was looking at this two accounts side by side, because what they reveal were some of the major changes that were happening. Changes in economics, changes in land use, and changes in political ideologies. And so just discovering more that the way that people in the Highlands, in the islands, were treated much the same as the Irish poor. And actually, it didn't matter that they were Catholics. They were not Catholics, most of them, but they were treated just as badly. And it was thought that they were, because they were Gaelic speaking, because they didn't speak English, that somehow they were stupid and they were feckless, and there were all sorts of, things said about them, which were a wonderful excuse for doing things to them in the pretext of doing things for them, and in the interest of those who were doing that. So it was in part really just the ignorance, my ignorance. And then another thing, some years ago, I was in Canada, and I met up with a woman who is a very distinguished and well-known poet and playwright, who had written to me after she'd read one of my books, called Nurbese Philip. And she lives in Canada now, but she's originally from Tobago in the Caribbean. And so we'd had a correspondence, and we met up, and we were having this conversation. She was talking about Tobago, and she told me that her grandfather had a Scottish name. He was called I think he was called McNeil. And it took me a minute to work out why this African Canadian woman had a Scottish named grandfather. And then, of course, I was terribly embarrassed when I found out. And that made me go and research more about the history of Scots in the Caribbean during the era of slavery, and after the era of slavery, because it didn't finish then. The impact of that continued on well after slavery technically was ended.
And in many ways it's carried on to the present day. I remember being in Kingston, Jamaica for the International Ecumenical Peace Convocation in 2011 at the end of the decade to overcome violence. I don't think we quite succeeded in that task, but seeing the monument to the children killed in violence in the heart of Kingston, where easily 80% of the names are Scottish names and taken from the plantation owners. You organized the book in a really interesting way, Kathy. And I was looking at this and kind of hearing Leslie in my ear going, is this really how to organize a history? And there's no right or wrong way, obviously, but really, I found it really compelling the way that you began with the ground, and with this sense of what was the place from which this began, and you locate yourself within Ayrshire and within the rural communities. And then you organize it around gender, around the fathers and the mothers. Then you tell the story of the mid-Victorian family. And then you, having gone through almost the kind of the biological thematics and the connection to land, you then move it into an organization which is much more political, and where you don't in any way, shape or form hide your own opinions. Not that any of us who know you, Kathy, would expect you to hide your opinions. And in many ways, this was one of the things I found really refreshing and compelling when I was reading the book. And so you've got a whole section on conscience, on contention and on control, a section on dissent, progressive pragmatism and social justice, on life and learning, and on migration and empire, and showing how all of those elements, particularly within Presbyterianism and within the church, formed your family genealogy in different ways. And clearly, you know, the statistical records have been, and the parish records have been really key to helping you excavate that and discover for the work. But again, I was just wondering about that organization of the book. You know, to me, it's redolent of the justice, peace, integrity of creation commitments within the Iona community's own rule. But what also brought you to organising the material around those themes?
I don't know. I think it's really just the way my mind works. And I have to say I'm very grateful to Leslie because she's a proper historian, and she lent me all her books, and she you know, commented and gave great assistance with a lot of my research, and I don't know if this is a kind of key thing, but I am very grateful to her because at quite a late stage of proofreading, she drew my attention to the fact that everywhere in the manuscript I had exclamation marks. And so I removed about 70 exclamation marks from my text. And it made me realize that I go through life in quite often in a state of outrage, or bewilderment or wonder or amazement or something. But I realized that, you know, that people could supply their own exclamation marks if they felt it was appropriate. So in terms of, yes, I mean, I do think you kind of begin where I just began where I am and worked outwards. And I think that, you know, dealing with the church and Presbyterianism in particular in Scotland, you can't help but doing that if you're writing, you know, anything to do with the social history of Scotland over the last 400 years or so, because, well, I mean, because it was so formative and so ubiquitous in the lives of Scots. And then, of course, it was, you know, very much a big part of our own family's life, and growing up and community and so on.
I was really struck by one of the passages where you're talking about the rebellion that occurred in 1562 and the provost of Maybole, and the records there begin with, and they disagreed over prayer. And
yes.
that was the beginning of it.
I love that story. I think it's such a funny story. And I thought actually I would read a little bit of it. Is that okay if I do that?
Please do.
Yeah.
That was your prompt.
Yeah. So this is a story from Maybole, which is a small town in Ayrshire, and it's the part of the parishes, one of the parishes that our ancestors came from, and it's, you know, it's not necessarily a place that people would be familiar with, but this is, I think this is one of its main claims to fame, was something called the Great Debate at Maybole, and this took place at the time of the Scottish Reformation, which was a time of great contentiousness and upheaval in Scotland, where in 1562 3 acts were passed by the Scottish Reformation Parliament that had rejected the authority of the Pope, abolished the jurisdiction of the Catholic Church in Scotland, ratified and adopted the Scots Confession of Faith, and declared celebration of the Mass to be a punishable offence, ultimately for repeat offenders by death. And this is a story about the encounter between the Abbot of Crossraguel, which was an abbey in Maybole, just outside Maybole, who was a man called Quintin Kennedy. And the Kennedys were the kind of leading family in that part of Ayrshire. So this is how the story goes. Quinton Kennedy, the abbot of Crossraguel, preached a sermon in the parish church of Kirkoswald, attacking the doctrines of the reformers and defending the traditional teaching on communion. Learning of this, John Knox, who was visiting nearby, courting his very young second wife, arrived at Kirkoswald Church the following Sunday with a large number of supporters, hoping to engage the abbot in dispute, but the abbot was not there. However, hearing of Knox's visit, he wrote him a letter effectively challenging the reformer to a theological duel on the doctrine of the sacrament of communion, promising safety from any injury or molestation, looking instead for familiar, formal, and gentle reasoning. Knox accepted the challenge, and so took place the great debate at Maybole. The participants met on the 28th of September 1562 at 8 a.m. in the house of the provost of Maybole. It must have been a big house because, as well as the main protagonists, each had with him 40 supporters. There were minute takers and various members of the nobility and gentry of the county, all in the presence of the abbot's uncle, the third Earl of Cassilis. They disagreed over the prayer at the start, then argued for 3 days over the role of Melchizedek in the book of Genesis. Unsurprisingly, after what has been described as a good deal of quibbling and tedious altercation, which never seemed to get anywhere, everyone was bored, tired, and irritated. The gentry were unimpressed with their accommodation. The Reformed supporters thought that the townspeople of Maybole were sadly lacking in their hospitality. And one of them was heard to remark that if anybody brought bread and wine, he would gladly accept it and care not what it meant. The debate ended with no conclusion when people voted with their feet. There are those who may feel that a template was set for theological debate in Scotland, which has been adhered to ever since. The citizens of Maybole, who had never wanted the debate in the first place, gathered up all the books that had been brought by the abbot for reference and burned them publicly. Another unfortunate precedent.
It's an absolutely extraordinary story, but I'm also surprised, and I may well be wrong, that it hasn't yet been dramatized. Because it
would make a great play.
A great stage play. Kathy, I want to give you a wee rest and invite Callum up, because I know that he's had a big stake in a lot of what you've been writing, and he's the genealogist in your family. And I'd love to hear from Callum his views of the book, having read it. And I see, Callum, you've got a whole host of people sitting behind you on your shoulder. Do you want to tell us who's behind you, just to start?
Well, I very much would like to tell you who's behind. But just before I do that, I would like to just say good morning, cousins. Good afternoon, cousins, and good evening, cousins, because as I look on the screens, I have picked out some of my cousins who are all over the world. And I feel that I'm also using the term cousins in a very affectionate way to embrace everybody, because of course we are all cousins, not just back to our common ancestors in Africa, but almost certainly the vast majority of those present this evening will share ancestors probably only 12, 13, 14 generations back. So it's lovely to see not all, some of my cousins. The picture is one of my favorites. And one of the joys of genealogy is when you come across a picture of somebody that you've not had before. This isn't actually one of these pictures, but the very distinguished looking lady there is my gran. And I know that many of the people present here know my family, and some people will remember Granny Orr, who was really just a legend. And although I was young when she died, I've got such fond memories of Gran. This picture was taken 99 years ago in the back garden of a house in Dumbarton. And the other 4, I'll just need to move my head, are her 4 sons. The first is David, whose son Ian, I think, is here listening this evening. David Orr, famous in Glasgow for all sorts of wonderful reasons. On the other side of Gran, and I'm not quite sure what the orientation is here, as I'm looking at the picture, it's on my right, but on my left, but I'm not sure. Anyway, that's Lyle, who went to Canada. And I know that his daughter Susan is also here, another of my cousins. Sitting higher up and looking down is Bertie. And sadly, I never knew Bertie because Bertie was in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. He was called up to the Second World War. He was fighting in the Far East. He was captured in Malaya and died in a prisoner of war camp in 1942 in Kuala Lumpur. And one of the very poignant moments of my life was going to visit his grave a few years ago, which I wouldn't really have known anything about had I not done this research. And finally, just looking over my shoulder here, many, many people know Jack, remember Jack, my father, but maybe you had never seen him as a 2-year-old. If you want me just to give a couple of reflections about my contribution to the book, and when Neil introduced me, he said, the genealogist for the book. That's absolutely not how it started. As Kathy said at the start, sadly, I only started on this journey literally the day after my mother, Janet, died. And we were looking through photographs and documents, and I just realized how little I knew about the family. And thankfully at that point, this coincided with really quite a sudden growth of online resources, in particular Scotland's people.gov.uk. Fantastic site which allows you to access all sorts of information about people over the last up to 500 years. In these early years, so I'm talking now about 2003, 4, 5, if I told anybody I was doing this, most people really didn't know much about genealogy and how to trace your family tree. They thought it involved going off to register house, as indeed it did. Things are very different now. I would imagine many people present tonight have done something very similar to what I've done and have gone back and used these great resources and found out about their families. And of course, every single family is full of individuals with the most incredible stories and the most mundane stories. And I think that's something that comes through in Kathy's book. You know, ours is a very, very normal family. I enjoy watching Who Do You Think You Are? They always manage to dig up some great scandal or some royal ancestor. None of that for us. But it has given me an enormous respect for the people whose existence have led to my presence here. They lived hard lives. I think we all know that back in any time before, I guess, the 20th century, life was hard, and things were difficult. People knew tragedy. I think it was very, very rare for a family not to have at least one, if not two or three, or in some cases 7 or 8 children dying in infancy. People died young, and it's one of my reflections is that most of what we know about our ancestors through records, it's not very happy stuff. Other than the births and the marriages, it's death. It might be a court appearance. It might be a record in a poorhouse, or as is the case with Catherine Lyle, whose story is just so tragic. The records of a lunatic asylum, and it kind of makes me wonder, in 100 years' time, will our descendants be interested in our stories? And if they are, where are they going to start? They're going to be absolutely overwhelmed. When one Googles oneself, and I know you've all done it, is that what we will want our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to see about us? When they're trawling through our Facebook stuff or our other social media, you know, there is just so much that is there, and it will be very, very difficult, I think, for our great-grandchildren to kind of get a sense of who we are in all the stuff that's there. Whereas for us looking back, it's really difficult to get a sense of our ancestors because there's so little. And what does exist tends to be the kind of official stuff. And I think one of the other things that Catherine's book does is give us an insight into some of the characters. I've mentioned Catherine and Catherine's husband, Adam McClellan, who is some character. We know more about Adam because he featured prominently in lots of local press, and that's a great source of information. And yeah, I think I'll just finish there because I think people might want to be asking questions, mainly of Kathy, but perhaps of me. But the final thing that I said in my little appendix was about the oral history and the knowledge that people have. And I would implore younger members of tonight's gathering to talk to your grandparents, to talk to your parents, to talk to your aunts and uncles and the people from previous generations. Because I just didn't. Well, maybe I did in some respects, but there is so much that I would have loved to quiz Jack and Janet and Gran and Uncle David about. And even if they're reluctant, you know, our father had experience training for the RAF in the Second World War. He never spoke much about that, and he certainly hardly ever mentioned Bertie and Bertie's experience in the prisoner of war camp. So please do talk to older relatives and friends, and those of us who are now these older people. Tell these stories, tell your children, tell your grandchildren, even if they don't seem particularly interested just now, which is probably going to be the case. Foist your stories on them, insist that they listen, because one day they will be interested.
Thank you, Callum. Thank you. And for that really passionate plea to everybody to tell the stories, just tell the stories and be a storyteller in the way that Kathy has been in this book as well. Just before I bring people in for questions, and I know people will be full of questions, but also probably stories as well. I was really struck as I was reading it by the work that we've had to do to stitch together pasts again. We've had to go to records. They've been dispersed there. It's hard. It's the hard work of history making and thinking through how we discover where the archives are. particularly as people are displaced or moved around. And I was really struck by the way that particularly in within the Māori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I've spent a bit of time, there's a way that people introduce themselves, which is automatically with their genealogy of place, of river and of mountain, and of and then of their paternal grandparents and maternal grandparents, their parents, and then of themselves. And that this is how you introduce yourself. So I would say, you know, I grew up in Sheffield. The hills near me were Calwak and Higatua. The water was the water of the Moss Valley. My grandparents on my father's side were butchers. My grandparents on my mother's side were weavers and tailors and personnel officers. You know, my own parents were teachers of music and science. And then I would say, and I am Alison, and my children are from Eritrea. And that's how I would introduce myself. And that when you do that, what I've noticed when Māori do that, but what I noticed in reading Kathy's book and in listening to you, Callum, is the way that becomes, it manifests many different edges and points of contact where we can start a conversation and where we can come in to a story of who we are. Where we can say, yeah, this is who we are. And that is in and of itself is a place that we can go for making peace. Because the more that we reduce ourselves to a single narrative and saying, this is who we are, and it's, you know, it's a blood and soil narrative and that is all, then the easier it is to other people and say that they are different and they might be enemies or they might be people we are against. And the more we tell these stories of vast complexity, of poverty and riches, of dissent over prayer, of movement around countries and places, the more we find ourselves weaving our ways back into a fabric, and that there's a great deal of wisdom in the introduction of oneself through one's affiliations to place and to people and to the things that we might have made with our lives and our hands. So thanks to Kathy and to Callum. I am sure there are many members of the Orr family who, particularly the many cousins online, who would like to ask some questions, but I also know there are many other people from the Iona community and further afield who will be burning to ask questions. So I am keeping an eye on my screen and also hoping that we might have Isabel's assistance just in letting people ask questions, either drop them in the chat and I can read them out, or just to come in and ask you a question of Kathy and Callum yourselves. I'm keeping an eye out for hands going up. Any questions? Or just unmute yourselves and speak.
I'll speak. This is Catherine Preston in the USA, and I just have to make a comment. I read the book from cover to cover, and I was entranced. And just entranced, I don't know very much about Scottish history, like practically nothing. But I think, Alison, you've made it very clear that the way that personal histories can fold into history, other people's histories, in a way that makes history much more, accessible, is what Kathy's done here. And I mean to show it to a dear friend right down the road who is an academic historian. He writes a lot of those kinds of books that I can't necessarily read. I found this entrancing. I just wanted to say that from the USA. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine. There's a comment from Marion as well in the chat saying, I think a lot of us share what Callum is saying about telling the stories and asking questions before it's too late. And then there's a question for you from Kathy, I think from Kathy and Callum actually, from Grace Franklin, asking how long did it take to complete from starting the family tree to finishing the joined up social history? Which is a really good question.
Well, I guess it took I guess it took 20 years. It took like 10 years of Callum's researching, and then, well, 10 years of writing, but actually, really, it took 4 years to write, because 6 of these I was elsewhere occupied.
And Callum, how about actually trying to complete the family tree?
Well, so
It's not complete.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that the answer is forever, because it will never be complete. I'm delighted to announce to people that don't know that know me that my daughter-in-law had a beautiful baby girl just over a month ago called Isabella. And I took great pleasure in adding Isabella to my family tree. And one day Isabella might in turn add her children to whatever exists in these days. So it is a non-stop everlasting process, which is wonderful. Although for me now it's far more about finding out about these people and their lives and times than adding more and more names to the tree. For anybody who has not done this, you can actually sit down with Scotland's people if your family was in Scotland, or with Ancestry or something similar, and probably in the space of 2 or 3 hours, you can find out quite a lot and probably get as far at least as great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. But from that point, it is then just a never-ending challenge.
Thanks, Callum. There's a question from somebody called Helen Galloway, who Kathy might know. just a hunch, but she's asking, Kathy, did you identify? In fact, I think for both of you, did you identify with any particular ancestor?
Oh, I think that probably I'd have to say the person that I identified most was a man called John Fleming. And he was a landscape gardener, and he was, and I identify with him because I'm myself a very keen, although not necessarily a very good gardener, but I identify with him a lot. He was the gardener, the head gardener at Kilmahue Castle, down in Cardross, and he trained as a master gardener, in the Glasgow Botanics, which is about 5 minutes from my house. So I always have but also he wrote books. It was really interesting to discover 4 generations back, a member of the family who published books, and his books were all about gardening. The one that I have is called Wildflowers of the West of Scotland, which is very, appropriate, and he's written, he wrote others about, growing fruit and so on. And he was also a great one for having theological opinions in his books. There's quite a bit about him in the book. And he was for many, Kilmahue Castle eventually became a very famous Catholic seminary, which had a very famous building, which was built in the 1980s, and is on the 100 most endangered buildings in the world, according to Historic Environment Scotland. And it's been a rather disastrous story, really, but this famous piece of modernist architecture is gradually crumbling into dust. And the gardens are not what they used to be, but they were fabulous, the gardens, I think, in the Victorian era. So that was me.
Yeah. Am I right in thinking as well that he lost a lot of his money and he died a debtor?
Well, it wasn't he lost a lot of his money, but I think that by the time he came to retire, you know, there were no pensions in these days. So he invested money in setting up a seed merchants in Glasgow, which then went bankrupt, and he was brought into the debtor's court. And he ended up living in a street very close to here, in a flat in Gibson Street. And his wife had to go out to work as a domestic servant. And it was just something about the insecurity of somebody who had served this family, this rich family, very, very well, you know, and made their garden famous. But then, you know, really had a terrible struggle in his old age, and ended up being a greengrocer in Maryhill. Mm-hmm. So I think, yeah.
Callum, I was just wondering if there was an ancestor, as you've been doing research, you particularly
well, even after 60 years, I still have a natural deference to my older and wiser sister. And I should have jumped in sooner, because that's who I would have said as well, for many of the same reasons. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that I necessarily identify with any one more than others, and I always find what's the program called again? Who Do You Think You Are? Mm-hmm. You know, they make a great play about, oh, here's the one. This is who I inherited all my artistry from, or you know, my resilience, and you know, I think that's a bit of nonsense, to be honest. So no, there aren't any that I necessarily identify strongly with, other than the guy that's looking over my shoulder, of course, Jack, who I do think that I share quite a lot of characteristics with. I would have loved to know my grandfather, Clement Johnson, who was a miner, but also a thespian. He directed plays in Stonyburn and starred in these plays. And I think he was probably quite a character. Sadly, he died very, very young, in his 40s. So none of us knew him.
I wonder how many of us start sentences with, I would have loved to known. You know, when you hear those stories of people in your family, I would have loved to have known my great-grandma Barnes, who was killed in a road traffic accident, aged 92, 2 weeks before I was born. And, you know, there's the stories about her in my family are legendary, you know, and every now and then at family gatherings, people go, oh, your great-grandma Barnes, she'd be turning in her grave if she thought you ever voted anything but Labour. And you can hear those kind of characters, and I can see people laughing at that, those thoughts that you're having yourselves of people that you connect to when you hear that phrase that you've just used, Callum. Marilyn has asked a question, and Leslie wants to say something, and Leslie, being Leslie, has said she doesn't want to say anything till others have had the chance to ask their question. So I'm going to ask Marilyn's question, but then I'm going to come to Leslie. Marilyn's question is, how far back does the family tree go? And with such strong family links with Iona, do you feel particularly drawn to the connection with Isla? So maybe Callum, you can start with how far back.
So it goes back to about 1650, and the line stops with Andrew Campbell, who was the first of the Campbell line of farmers, Ayrshire farmers, and I've found great difficulty in going any further back there. We also go back to similar periods, late 17th century, in West Lothian, Bathgate. The Johnson line goes back pretty much to that same point. And of course, much further back than that, unless you descend from aristocracy, it's unlikely that there's going to be a written record of any of your family. I visited Isla and went to Kilcoman, which is where Archibald Gilchrist and then his daughter Marion Gilchrist came from. It's absolutely beautiful, looking out to the wild Atlantic, and in some ways very similar to Iona. And yes, there is a kind of pull there. There's a legend in our family, in the Johnson family on my mum's side, that we descend from people who were in the Spanish Armada. And needless to say, I've found no evidence of that whatsoever. But if we do, I would imagine it's through Marion Gilchrist, because there were ships from the Armada that were shipwrecked in that area. And my understanding is that the name Gilchrist may have some link with a similar Spanish name, although I've not quite got round to finding out about that either.
Mm. Yeah. How about you, Kathy? That draw to land, Iona and Isla.
These are, well, I haven't been to Isla, although I would love to go. And obviously Iona, and also for me, the Ross of Mull. But do you know, the place that is, I feel that I belong is right where I am in Glasgow, because actually one part of the family goes back, you know, way back into the 18th century in Glasgow. And in this part of, actually in this part of West Glasgow, when hardly any of it was here. So, and, you know, discovering that John Fleming, I'm sure that's another reason I feel connected to him, that he lived in the next street to where I now live. That makes me feel that this is, you know, this is my place. And you know, a city is the ground as well. You know, it's just ground with buildings on it.
I'm really, I'm noticing as you're saying that, you know, a kind of a lot of really quite complicated thoughts that come up for me. You know, when I think of myself as someone who's migrated, you know, who lives, you know, a good 6 hours drive or train ride away from where I grew up, and that was a ground that my parents had migrated to, and they lived in a place that their families had had to migrate to, and they'd migrated down valleys during the enclosure, and then the railways being part of the forced disinheritance of people. And I often think there's something really wonderful about discovering that there are roots, and that within those people who've been part of long-term migrant communities, and people who've ended up settling in other places, which is always a complicated action. There's also something about discovering those resonances of place, or where you come back to, that can often feel quite imaginary, but where you forge a deep connection to a place. And that, now I too have come to say, this is where I'm from. This is where I live, this is where I have and make my being, without it having been a place where there is no trace of a bloodline anywhere near where I live, you know, within at least 300 miles, I would say. And that those are quite, I think those are quite interesting things when we're grappling with these questions of genealogy and who we are as migrants, as well as who we are as people of place.
I think that's right. And I think that, you know, I wasn't born in Glasgow. I didn't grow up in Glasgow. And you know, these are imaginative responses to being in a place. It's also that I decided to make Glasgow my place, and that was also connected to people. That was connected to primarily to my grandmother who lived here. But I think that one of the things that doing this made me think about, you know, that there were people in the book in our family who moved a few miles every 50 years. Yeah. And they just, you know, basically they moved from one pit to the next pit where a new seam opened up. And there are people who went to the other side of the world, and some came back and most didn't. And that's why, you know, like so many Scots, we've got so many relations in Canada. And then the Canadian ones have subsequently been joined by other Scots who then think also they have a people and a place in Canada. And I think that you know, you don't just grow with roots, you put down roots. That's a transplantation, but it's it's an important one.
Yeah, thanks. I wonder if we might bring Leslie in at this point, Isabel, if that's possible, because I know she'd like to say something.
And maybe David as well.
Yeah.
I did wonder which of the sisters would call on David.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks to everybody. What a big crowd of people have come to talk about our family, or to hear about this adventure, this journey of exploration that prompted by Callum. We've all been on over the last 20 years. It's really 20 years, Callum, since Mum died. I mean, I'm kind of randomly responding to some of the things that people have said, and I suppose also drawing on my own experience of researching and writing history. The first thing I want to say is, of course, you know, half the population of Scotland claims that it has roots in the Spanish Armada. Is anyone who's got dark hair and olive skin. That's what people always say. And it's interesting how, you know, how myths and stories.
It has to be true for some of us.
Yeah. But these things kind of weave in and out of the way in which people communicate their family stories, or fragments of them, and certain things are retained and other things are lost. I'm also remembering Gran, whom I knew, you know, as Callum did, just as a child, really. But she made a big mark in our lives. You know, she was one of these countless, nameless, faceless people, you know, all these people who belong to our past and have created the kind of world and the kind of society, the kind of nation, the kind of city, the kind of village that we live in. And what I remember particularly about Gran, and it's responding to something Alison said, is the way in which she went through life with a fascination, a love, a kind of burning interest in other people. And wherever she was and wherever she went, she would strike up conversations. And she was always just so interested in other people, where they came from, what they did, who their family was, and so on. I mean, she would have been great at 6 degrees of separation. For her, it was usually like 2 or 3 before she made a connection, wherever she travelled, and mostly that was around Scotland and Great Britain. But she did get to Canada in her old age, and I think, you know, her model of engagement and of storytelling and being an interested listener to other people's stories is a really good one to follow. Of our family, you know, the story in our family, one of the things that strikes me about it is not just that our forebears lived hard lives, but they were lives of great precarity. And, you know, it didn't matter, you know, whether you were working class, middle class, you know, more or less comfortable, solid Ayrshire families farming. The circumstances of people's lives and the bigger patterns of development, land use, land ownership, the way in which land was developed, the so-called improvements, the Industrial Revolution. These are the things that generate these changes and generate movements, both people staying in places and people having to move. And the constant uncertainty
in a world where there was so little provision made for social security, that notion of social security. And of course, a lot of that then, you know, the families had to depend on each other as they still do. But it has really struck me, both in our family history and you know, looking at bigger patterns and other developments, just to realize that, and to realize, you know, how the bigger dynamics of continuity and change shape us. So we can be makers, but we're also very much, we're agents, but we're also constrained and shaped by the bigger dynamics and the bigger developments that are happening. You were talking, or there was a question about, you know, who do you connect with? And I've also been to Islay. In fact, I've stayed in the cottages. There's a little row of cottages beside the house that our great grandfather would have lived in when he was the school teacher there. And it's really stunning. It's really beautiful. And you know, there's part of you that feels drawn, and you want to connect. You want to feel rooted in these gorgeous, beautiful places, although they had their own hardships and struggles. Of course they did, as we know from the history of Iona and the Ross of Mull as well. But do you know, I look at the Badlands between Edinburgh and Glasgow, the landscape, the blasted landscape of the mining country of West Lothian. And I think that, you know, that's where I feel most connected, oddly enough. Very, very close to where Janet, my mum, was born. There are 5 bings, and they're called the 5 sisters. And I love those. I love the shape that they make. They're a beautiful shape, but also I love the fact that, you know, my mother was one of 5 sisters who were, you know, living in the shadow of that, and just the hardship that and often it's the, you know, these people struggling just for sheer survival, that I feel really connected to. The women, my grandmother Sarah, whom I never knew, and her mother, and her mother. And I think it's really important that we create space and find the ways in which to share and to communicate, and to learn more about the circumstances of those people's lives, and not to be tempted, as Kathy said, sometimes just to want to feel a strong kind of sense of rootedness just because somewhere happens to be, you know, beautiful. I love the sea, I love the sky, and I've always thought, you know, is that the Spanish Armada? You know, you can make up all sorts of stories about these things for yourselves. Yeah. But you know, there's so much of fascination, and so much that we've enjoyed sharing over the years, and some of the harder things that we all have to collectively confront about the social and political and economic realities of our history. So not only would I encourage you to, I've done oral history, I've recorded lots of oral history interviews, and you know, when Mum and Dad died, I thought, why on earth? Why have I talked to all those other people and not talked to my own parents and recorded what they said? And I'm very glad that my son Lorne, who makes films, has already done that with his gran, with Peter's mum. You know, if you've got other, you know, facilities to do that, then I would certainly encourage you to do that. But also, don't chuck things out. Don't chuck out. I'm just looking at Molly Harvey, and she's got a whole shelf full of books of every year of her life. So, you know, if there's anything like that in your house, don't chuck it out. Somebody will find it really useful and really interesting.
Thanks, Leslie. I'm really hoping that Robert, who's in the next room, is listening to you at this moment. I was really struck as you were talking, Leslie, about the way that for me, so much of this was the history and the reminder of what life is like when we don't have a welfare state. when
Yeah.
there isn't a safety net, when there isn't those equalizing moments. And there are points where, Kathy, you very clearly state, you know, the way that you have been part of a generation that has grown up with free access to education all the way through to higher education, free access to health, where there is housing provision and social provision, and that, you know, by a long way you have had a safety net behind you to allow you to think and work and study and travel and live, that you're particularly the women ancestors in your family could not have hoped for all the way through. But I want to come, you know, on that note, I want to come to David. I have just messaged David, ask if he's happy to be dragged into this lot by his two sisters. And David, just, you know, maybe to start with you and see if there's an ancestor you particularly relate to.
Oh gosh. No, although there was an earlier draft of this book that had two little boys who ended up in a reformatory school in Glasgow, and I'm really disappointed that they've sort of slipped off the edge of this family story, because they just seemed like they were, you know, everything that everyone talks about, the things that we've been talking about during this conversation. You want to own people. You want to own the history that this delivers for you. It's easy to own the people who you think, oh yeah, they were good people. They made a mark in the world. They were the ones who, you know, made this difference, or they were clearly good, strong, upright citizens. It's good to own those people. And it's very, very difficult to own the people who you think, I really don't think I would have liked that person if I'd met them. But the scamps, the mischievous ones, they're a lot of fun, and you want to be able to own those people as well. My kind of comment about all of this is that I'm not a historian, I'm not a genealogist, I haven't written the book. I've kind of felt like an engaged outsider. No, not outsider, I'm definitely an insider, but something of a bystander through the process. And it's been great watching the work that Callum's done, reading the early drafts of the various chapters as Kathy's been producing them, hearing the kind of thoughtful, almost academic critique that Leslie's been able to come up with, and just occasionally interjecting a sentence or two or a comment or two along the way. But you know, the thing that I found most interesting about it is I knew almost none of this, and I now know a great deal about it. We've talked, and I've read the various chapters, I've read the early drafts, and I've really enjoyed doing that and learning as we went. And then we got the final version, the book, and I read it again, and I still found a whole lot of stuff that I didn't know. Having read all of it in one form or another, I still found a whole lot I didn't know, not just about our family, but about Scotland and our history. And that's been fantastic. And I think we're all storytellers in our family. I think in one form or another, that marks us out. That's what we've done. We've had different professional careers. I think we've all been people who have kind of cared about social justice, but I think we're all storytellers. And you know what Callum said, what Kathy's echoed, what Leslie said, tell the story. That's the job. Because if you're not telling the story, professionally, I've often said to people, tell our own story, because if you don't tell it, someone else will, and they'll tell it badly. They won't know nearly as much, or sometimes it won't get told at all. And neither of these things is good. Better to have the story told by people who are looking in than for it not to be told at all. But better still to have the story told by the people who know it, who understand it, who own it, and say, this is our story, this is who we are.
Good.
Thanks, David. Thank you so much. I really think, as we're coming up to time, I've got an eye on the clock, but I really think we're all being given a really privileged insight into what conversations must be like when the four of you siblings gather and start to dispute, and that story that that Kathy talked about from Maybole, the dispute over prayer. I can hear echoes of it, of each of you come in and go, yes, or yes, but, and you bring your own perspective onto the histories that you have, or the way that you see them, or the angles you might bring on telling them, but that you, each of you, and I think we're all getting a really strong and really privileged sense of that, have the same voiced conviction of the importance of telling the stories and of not letting others take that power away from you, and of insisting on the justice that is found inside that storytelling. And I'm seeing the younger generation in the chat beginning to tell their own stories. There's a little comment there from Helen saying, sorry, we are in an Italian holiday park and have to take the kids to the disco. Enjoy the rest of the celebration. Go, mum, whoop. And Leslie will be delighted that Helen has actually put an exclamation mark after that. So clearly following in the footsteps. I wonder, Kathy, if we might just come back to you for a few last words, and whether there's another part of the book that you might want to read to us at this point before we close off the evening.
I think it's interesting. It was interesting for me that towards really the last chapter, that the last couple of chapters, I think I became much more opinionated or expressive of my opinions about things. I mean, particularly in relation to Scotland and politics, and to many of the issues that we've pursued. I mean, I guess, in education and in housing and in in gender justice, all the things that we've been engaged with, and just kind of getting gradually a bit more, drawing conclusions or having opinions about history, which is one of the things you're kind of not supposed to do, and I felt that about, and because that's all based on the perspective that there's a true version, and that somebody, the BBC has the proper neutral version, and everything else is just a divergence, and that's not the case, and thinking about that, about talking about slavery, for example, where people say, oh well, it was different then, and actually realizing and discovering that in the late 18th century, people in Scotland, in their tens of thousands, signed petitions, to the government about the slave trade, and that this is not, and petition writing is not something that people just did by doing a click on the internet. It was something that people really engaged with as a way of having a voice, but one of the things that really struck me about what are the narratives, there's a great quote by Ben Ockery that I've used at the end of the book, the last chapter, and it's about telling that, again, it's about telling stories. If we tell ourselves stories that are untrue, then that will affect who we are as a nation. And so I think that in this, I'm also trying to, try and tell some of the stories that haven't been told, often because they don't reflect well on Scotland and Scots. And I think that that's important. The deep engagement of Scots with racism, with with misogyny, with violence, and particularly with violence against women, all of these things that we still, are all the time coming to terms with, and thinking about what are the things that unite us and have united the United Kingdom, for example. Are there common stories that we have nationally? And thinking about the ones that we had in the past, the stories of empire, the stories of 2 world wars, and then the story basically of the welfare state. And these were strong unifying narratives. But I just, something else that really struck me when I was writing about West Lothian and the coal and shale miners and the lives that their communities had. So I'd written quite a bit about West Lothian, and thinking about austerity, which has been for me is quite an ambivalent word, because in lots of ways it's an age, a term I like. Anyway, so I wrote this about the age of austerity, drawing on the writings of Tony Judd, who was a historian, great historian. The 21st century age of austerity has proved to be pretty much like the 19th century West Lothian variety. Austerity for the many, huge profit for the few. In his splendid essay titled simply Austerity, the historian Tony Judd revisited another age of austerity, the immediate post-war years in 20th century Britain. Differentiating between austerity and poverty, he remembered that rationing and subsidies meant that the bare necessities of life were accessible to all, with free milk and orange juice for the children. He described how the family might have fallen on hard times, but we were all in it together. It was this togetherness that made tolerable the characteristic shortages and greyness of post-war Britain. The rich kept a prudently low profile. There was little evidence in these years of conspicuous consumption. Everyone looked the same and lived remarkably similar lives. In the same essay, Tony Judd suggests that austerity in post-war Britain was not just an economic condition, but that it aspired to be a public ethos, exemplified in its moral seriousness by Clement Attlee, the greatest reformer in modern British history. He claims that the opposite of austerity is not prosperity, but lux et volupte, luxury and pleasure. We have substituted endless commerce for public purpose, the togetherness of consumption, and expect no higher aspirations from our leaders. If we want better rulers, we must learn to ask more from them and less for ourselves. A little austerity might be in order. It was the 20th century age of austerity, with its post-war reforms and public ethos, which finally lifted my own West Lothian family out of the poverty, disease, and premature death, which had stalked them for 150 years. And there's just something about that phrase, moral seriousness, which, in a way, this is one of the things that I do think the stories of the past have conveyed something to me about the moral seriousness of our ancestors. The ones that, worked in the mines, the ones that worked in the land, I mean, whatever it was, the teachers, whatever it was that they were doing, a sense of moral seriousness. And, what does that mean to us today in our society? What does it mean for us as a nation? What does it mean for us as a world? My goodness. What are what are the things that we are, you know, that the past is speaking to us to say, you know, do this for the sake of the future. So that's it.
Thank you, Kathy, very much, and for that fantastic reading from Tony Judd's work as well, which and focusing us back onto the moral seriousness of the questions of the present, which, you know, in the past, in the stories of your family, you've found the precarity, the social security, the chances, the changes, the women who found a way through to continue to give life in such a way that you might be here today to tell the stories and be part of those stories, and for reminding us through the way that you've written the book, and the way you've spoken about the famine in Ireland, of the way in which right now wars are being fought where grain is being withheld from the poorest in the world, so that mass famine will take many lives. And that these questions that you found inside of your own family history are alive for many, particularly in low to middle income countries, and particularly for those who are displaced from their homes at this moment in time, and are hoping for something that might be like the small miracle of social security that we've been able to enjoy and been able to share. I want to thank Callum for all the work that you've done on the family genealogy and just bringing the passion for telling stories, and the prompt, and that moment pretty much when you were starting to research the history after Janet's death was the moment when I stepped into membership of the Iona Community. I very much date my membership to when Kathy and Leslie and David and Callum lost their mother. So there's something of the work that you've been labouring with that also has gone alongside my own sense of an emergence into a community of faith and dissent and questioning. And thank you, Leslie, for helping remove those exclamation marks and going through that text and bringing all of that passion for history, and particularly the history of women and the history of places that may not be remarkable or beautiful until you start to discover the remarkable beauty in lives that are lived through austerity. And for David for coming and giving us those questions about history and housing and homes and place that are part of allowing the dissent and the questions, but also the points of agreement to come together. I think we've all just been really treated to something very special and quite remarkable. And I'm certainly wanting to go back and look at the work my mum's been doing at 81 on our family history, and thinking again in different ways about those questions. The poet Mary Oliver says in her instructions for living life, pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And I think that might be a really fitting way of just closing off with a tribute of those words to Kathy's book and the work that is very much a collective family work, but that we really see a paying of attention, a being astonished, and then a telling of it that means we can all share in this story in the way that we have done tonight. So thank you everybody for coming, and I'm going to hand back over to Neil. Thank you.
Just wanted to thank Kathy and Callum and Alison. Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for coming.
Oh, and thank you, Neil, because this book would not have happened without your absolutely meticulous and wonderful editing.
Oh, that's really nice. Hey, okay, well, how about we'll give a free book away, Kathy's book. If you can give me a title of another Kathy Galloway book, either a book that Kathy wrote or a book that Kathy edited or co-edited. If you send me an answer right now, I'll take the first answer. It's neil@ionabooks.com, neil@ionabooks.com. I'll check my email tomorrow and you can get a free book. Easy, eh? So I wish you, have a good evening. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.